los generales, en democracia cayó la chica.
Okay, hello everybody. Hope you can hear me. Give us a thumbs up if you can. My name is Nick MacWilliam. I'm delighted to be chairing this event, especially after the result. I am a co-editor at Alborada, who are putting this event on, supported by the Progressive International and by Red Pepper. So massive thanks to them, and check out their coverage of Chile and Latin America. It's up there with Alborada's. I'm also the director of the documentary Santiago Rising, which was released at the beginning of this year on Alborada Films, and which is available to watch online. And there'll be a link posted in the chat. It kind of tells the story of the social explosion which occurred in Chile in late 2019. Traces that back to the dictatorship, and we will be hearing more about that, no doubt, and how that's fed into what took place in Chile last night. We're also streaming this event live on YouTube, so do feel free to share the link with anybody you like. And we are also recording. So yes, that's just a few items of housekeeping. Having said that, I am also, sorry, one moment, please. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we've got a series of excellent speakers. We also have time for questions at the end, so I won't take too much of your time now. I just want to say, you know, it was a hell of a night in Chile. I expect a lot of us wish we'd been there. If you saw the pictures of Santiago last night, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets to celebrate Gabriel Boric's phenomenal victory. I don't really think there's any other word we can use to describe it. But I'll admit, I was pretty nervous going into the second round of the election, particularly given what happened in the first round in November, when the far-right pro-Pinochet candidate, Jose Antonio Cast, actually got the highest number of votes, getting around 2% more than Gabriel Boric did in that round. But that took them both through to the second round, which was held yesterday, on what was a baking hot day in Santiago. And there was lots of reports that public transport wasn't working, amidst rumours that this was a deliberate ploy to prevent people from going or reaching polling booths. So all in all, you know, for the progressive movement in Chile to have pulled off an extraordinary result is quite remarkable. Boric has turned he was 2% down in the first round. He's turned that into almost 12% margin of victory. So I don't really think anyone was expecting, you know, for him to basically win by such a large margin. The polls had it very, very close. So I'm really, really excited to hear, or I'm really happy for one, as I'm sure many of you are, but I'm also really excited to hear from our speakers today. We've got at least 3 speakers, and hopefully a 4th will join us. So I'm going to move on quite quickly to them because you know, we've got an hour and we'd like to have some time for questions at the end. I'll quickly say who our speakers are now, and then I'll hand over to our first one. So we're joined by Victor Figueroa Clark, who is an Alborada contributing editor, and he is also the author. He's a British Chilean, and he's also the author of Salvador Allende, Revolutionary Democrat, published by Pluto Press. If you haven't read that book, then you really should. I'm sure we'll post a link to that in the chat where you can get hold of it. We're also joined by Rocío Lorca, who is a law professor at the University of Chile in Santiago, and also campaigns in support of Boric. So really delighted to hear from Rocío. And we're joined also by Matt Kirkegaard, who was a member of the Progressive International delegation to Chile last month to observe the first round of elections. As I said, Progressive International is supporting this event, and Alborada is also a Progressive International partner. So we're really delighted to have Matt here and to reflect on his observations when he visited Chile last month. And the Progressive International has been very, very vocal in supporting Chile's, the quest of the Chilean people to establish a more egalitarian, fairer political system, and finally put an end to the neoliberal authoritarian system, which has been in place for pretty much almost 50 years, since the 1973 military coup, which put General Pinochet in power and basically turned Chile into the neoliberal laboratory for policies which were then adopted in the UK, in the USA, and many, many other parts of the world. And that laboratory, of course, was built on the blood, the torture, the exile, and the disappearance of thousands and thousands of people. So, it's a really, really historic moment in Chile. And I'm really, really delighted to introduce our first speaker. So I'll hand over to Victor Figueroa Clark. And Victor, perhaps you could just talk a little bit about, what you consider a Boric agenda, a Boric program to look like, what challenges he faces, and how he kind of turned from being 2% down into an almost 12% margin of victory, a phenomenal result. Is Victor here?
Thanks, Nick. Sorry, I was on mute and I couldn't unmute myself, apparently. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you again. It's been an immense 24 hours. It's been a huge day of hope, optimism, joy. My relatives and friends in Chile are over the moon with this. And I think it's a huge step forward towards casting off the chains of neoliberalism, as you were just saying, and the legacy, the long, dark legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship and the economic and social and political system that it embedded in Chile. I thought I'd take a couple of moments to sort of give some the main coordinates of what happened yesterday. I think maybe Rocío and people on the ground are better placed to give an analysis of exactly how this victory was achieved. But there's no doubt, as Gabriel Boric said in his inaugural speech, or not inaugural, sorry, but in his first speech, in his victory speech, that this is the end of a historic cycle and it's the beginning of a new historic cycle. It's a historic victory that comes at a historic time. You've got a change in the generation of political leaders in Chile now. This is firmly the generation of 2006 onwards in the driving seat. The scale of the victory itself was historic. The highest electoral turnout in recent Chilean history, and obviously, as you were saying, a 12-point lead when most people were expecting a narrow victory of 1 or 2 points. There was a lot of nervousness and anxiety among people on the left in relation to what the result might be. And of course, I think it's historic in the sense that, from my point of view, this is a victory that was achieved by a combination of mobilizing a social base that was there as a result of the estallido, the protest movement, but with also an outstretching of the hand of friendship, as it were, to the political center. And I think together this brought in 1.5 million or so new voters. I think it's important to underline that a large number of those were people that didn't vote, I don't think, in the first round. But when they saw that the political process of the new constitution and of the reforms that the Chilean people have been fighting for over the last 2 or 3 years were under threat from caste, they came out to vote and to mobilize other people to vote as well. So it's a moment of real emotion, a real triumph for popular mobilization, but also, like you could argue, like institutionalized kind of politics as well. And it's a historic moment because I think there's an ideological crisis of the right in Chile and more broadly internationally, which is demonstrated in their sort of polarization that caste exemplifies. It's a time of where the US's capacity to influence and shape agendas in other parts of the world is declining to a degree. And at the same time, it's a time when China is growing in confidence and in economic might and potentially in political influence in different parts of the world. And obviously it's a time of pandemic, and it's a time when the Latin American left, after quite a long period, looks to be re-articulating itself. We've got the victory of the MAS in Bolivia, the left elected in Peru and Honduras, and obviously we've got elections next year in Colombia and in Brazil, which might bring us back to what used to be called the pink tide, although that's a phrase I'm not particularly keen on. Now, Boric's program is, as you'd expect, a comprehensive one. There's a program of economic revitalization, which is targeting explicitly small and medium enterprises. Up to about 1/3 of Chileans in the workforce are now in the informal sector. And so it's really important that those people with micro businesses and small businesses begin to feel support from the government. There's a health program, the provision of universal primary healthcare at least, and huge resources going to be diverted into mental health as well. A new social protection system with a reformed pension system, a universal pension, and a national care system as well. Obviously, a transitional reform to education towards universal free education through state loans, for example. There are labour reforms in his programme, sectoral collective bargaining, which was in Jeremy Corbyn's programme back in the day here, works councils, and collective bargaining being strengthened across the country. The gender aspect and anti-discrimination is a fundamental part of his programme as well. And there are housing projects, ecological programs, a media program for a new decentralized media system. So I think it's a program that is aimed at dealing with the very real crises that Chile faces, that the Chilean people face at the moment as a result of the pandemic, which is a socioeconomic crisis, a healthcare crisis, a pension crisis, where people have been withdrawing their pension savings in order to sustain themselves through the pandemic, which is something that can't be allowed to continue. There's a serious situation with a feeling of insecurity and levels of violent crime that are related to drugs gangs, which Boric, in the run-up to the second round, began to talk about much more. And it's probably one of the reasons for his success. And he wants to put this program through financed through a tax reform, the introduction of a high royalty on mining of copper and lithium, which might hit the profits of some of these big mining companies by about 50%, a crackdown on tax evasion, and what they call profit shifting in the language of the OECD, and also through social dialogue, which is obviously a very social democratic term. But he stated in his first speech that he wants this to be a government with its feet in the streets, a government that does more listening than talking, and a government that really does what it can to give Chile a substantive democracy built on grassroots organizations, on women, and on dialogue with all of the groups that make up Chilean society, including the indigenous. But obviously, it's a government that's going to face many challenges. I think one of the main ones is that the Congress is that he's going to be governing or presiding over is still stuck in the past. The recent elections have really failed to shake up the composition of that Congress. And so you see that the old parties of the Concertación are still well represented there, as is the right. And so the old 3/3 of the Chilean political system, I would argue, is still relatively, although it's adjusted somewhat, the composition has changed somewhat, it's still there. And that means that there's going to have to be a lot of horse trading now in order to get his program through Congress before the new constitution is developed. And that brings with it a whole set of problems. How's he going to work with the old parties of the Concertación? The Christian Democrats have said they will potentially support particular measures, but they don't want to go into the government. The other parties around the Socialist Party, the Radicals and so on, have said that they will negotiate as a bloc with Boric, and they will want their pound of flesh for the support that they give him in Congress. At the same time, he's coming in with a huge level of legitimacy. And that, in a sense, means that there's a strong incentive for political organizations to try and slipstream his popularity to sustain themselves as we move forward. He's going to have to work out how he develops his relationship with the biggest political party in Chile at the moment, which is the Communist Party, because I think we can already see that people associated to the right, to the business sectors, are saying that how he works with the Communist Party, his relationship with the communists, is going to be a key test of this government and its moderation. I think we probably will see maybe one communist minister. He said that in his cabinet is going to be gender equal. But whatever he does here, it's going to be a strong signal to markets, to the United States, to his own social support base, and to the opposition. And it's not just Congress that he's going to have to deal with. He's got governors across at regional level, the majority of whom are members of the old Concertación parties, mayors and councillors, and obviously state functionaries across the state. And this brings us to another challenge, which is how is he going to work to be able to turn the ship of state, as it were, and transform the practice of 30 years in institutions like Carabineros, the police, the army, and in the ministries. And what would happen if, as part of his crackdown on the drugs gangs, there is violence on the part of Carabineros? What happens if there are provocations in the indigenous parts of Chile in the south, in Araucanía? And how that would confront him with serious choices about whether to punish transgressions, for example, and he'd come under pressures to use the traditional tools that the Concertación and other governments have used in the past to deal with these problems. And so this is a big test. I think there's also a question around how the opposition will recompose itself and what that means for Boric. They CAST got 44% of the vote, which is obviously not a small vote. Will CAST be able to preside it, I think, is a question. There is a more social right associated with the current government in Congress that might mean that the right continues to be divided as we move forward in the next year or so. But that's a question, and how will he deal with that? He's already said he's going to build bridges. He mentioned CAST in his first speech, and so he's showing willingness to work with whoever needs to be worked with in order to come to specific agreements to get this program through. I think at international level, there are a series of questions to do with what might happen to the Chilean economy in the next year or so. Where is his investment going to come from? Where's his potential aid going to come from to get through the pandemic? What's he going to do in relation to Chinese relations with Latin America? What's he going to do in relation to the left within the region, which he's been critical of in some instances? So I think those are some of the challenges that his government will face. And of course, the challenge that I think Rocío is going to talk about, which is the challenge of the new constitution and ensuring that his government is able to successfully bring that constitutional process to a conclusion in order to really put the seal on the past and begin the new historic cycle as we move forward. And I think there's any government that is ruling while there's a constitutional process ongoing faces a degree of uncertainty, because what happens once that plebiscite on the new constitution happens, or hopefully happens at the end of May, will that then mean that there will have to be new elections for a new Congress, new institutions of Chilean democracy? And if there aren't, what does that say about his or that Congress's legitimacy? It could cause political problems. Anyway, there's more that we could talk about, and I'm sure that I'm looking forward to the discussion with the rest of the panel. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. That was really brilliant. Obviously no kind of lack of challenges facing a progressive government coming in, on top of almost half a century of neoliberal authoritarian policy making. I'm intrigued by how Boric is going to manage some of these relationships with the business community and with the security apparatus, because anyone who follows Chile will know that that's been unreformed basically since the days of Pinochet, and is incredibly authoritarian and has real problems in its relationship with the Chilean population. So with that, just before I introduce Rocío, I should have said at the beginning, please put your questions in the chat. And if we will have time for questions at the end to our different speakers. Put your question there. You do also have the opportunity to come on screen yourself to ask it, or I can read it out. If you do want to ask it yourself, please specify that when you post your question. Feel free to do that as of now. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rocío Lorca, Professor of Law at the University of Chile, one of the largest universities in the country, which has always been at the kind of forefront of political activism in many cases, because the student population in Chile is very politically active. Rocío also is a pro-Boric activist who's been in Santiago throughout all this period. So really happy to hear from her. So Rocío, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here, but I'm more happy because we won last night. I tried to prepare something, but my mind is everywhere. So I'm gonna take the risk of improvising in English, which may be not ideal, but I'll do my best. So I told Nick that I was going to talk more about the Constitutional Assembly, which is like very nice for me to do today, because since we started this second round, the campaign between Boric and Kast, we had sort of forgotten about the Constitutional Convention for a little bit and left it to the side for, I think, more than one reason. But the deadline is very tight. I mean, the times are short. We have to finish this constitution very soon. And so we have to be very quick in starting the conversation again about the constitution and sort of move forward. And I think it's very symbolic that we have Boric as the president, because as you may know or recall, we are now having a constitutional assembly, a convention, because of Gabriel Boric, because he was the one who made it possible. There were many voices for many years asking for a new constitution. This was not an idea that he came up with, but during the estallido, the sort of very quickly, it became clear that this was the both opportunity to sort of channel this energy, but also the opportunity to do this thing we wanted to do for many years, which was to finally have a democratic constitution that was not a neoliberal constitution imposed by the dictatorship, right? So it was like both things, I think. This was a project that we had there. Some presidents before tried to do it, it didn't work out. And then finally this appeared like the opportunity to do that, as well as that being a way of channeling this situation that was getting very hard and intense. I live right in Plaza Italia, where the estallido took place. And, you know, it was very intense and amazing in many ways, but it was also starting to get very exhausting, because the protests were Monday to Sunday. It was not just one day a week, and it was well, people were getting killed, there were people losing their eyes, you know. We had to find a way out of that, but it had to be a way that honored in some way the reasons why we had the estallido. So it couldn't just be any kind of solution, and so many people disagreed with the solution proposed by Boric, because it was kind of done through the institutions, and many social movements wanted a new constitution, but wanted the new constitution to be done outside of the institution and sort of in a real sovereign power, completely free from institutions. But, well, we can have this conversation in some other moment, but the final solution was the institutional one, right? This agreement of peace that Boric signed against his own political party with the other parties. And then, because I think he was the one to install this solution, he had I think a strong influence in the way in which the process was shaped, the rules that were established as to how we were going to develop the convention, when this was going to happen, who ended up being there in the convention. I think he had a lot of influence also in that, not just in making it happen, but also in the way and the shape it took. And so that, I think, it's very good in a way, because that process that started through him, it's now in its best possible scenario, because we know he's gonna take care of it. And this was happening till now, right? I mean, it's still not gonna happen till March, but at least now, I think we know the future of the Constitution is in good hands. But I think that something that's very interesting that happened with the Constitution is that, with the Constitutional Assembly, is that somehow I think it sort of backfired Boric once he became a candidate, and it became clear, I would say, in the first round that he was going to pass to the second round. One of the main strategies of the opposition was to use the Constitutional Assembly against Boric, because what happened basically when the Constitutional Assembly started functioning is that the government didn't give the Constitutional Assembly any resources. It was a disaster. The media coverage was very poor. They didn't have places to work. The places they had didn't satisfy sanitary conditions. The assistants of the conventionals, I think now they've been paid, but at least they were like 4 months without being paid their salaries. They didn't have basic things like cafe, place to eat in the place where they were meeting. And there were like a lot of problems. The inauguration also failed because there were technical problems. It was all a series of noise from a lack of protection by the government that sort of left the Constitutional Assembly on its own or by its own. And then, of course, a lot of things happened that were not very good for the Constitutional Assembly in terms of, well, it was a moment where a lot of identity groups came with their own demands, and there were fights inside the Constitutional Assembly, and there were some scandals, and there was a very emblematic case of a leader of the estallido who was caught in some lies, and it all became sort of very messy, and I think this made people lose faith both in the conventional constitution, but also in people like Boric and like in young left leaders, because it seemed like this wasn't what we signed up for. We don't understand what's going on. We are not talking the same language. And it wasn't, I think, clear for people that what was going to happen in the Constitutional Convention was exactly what we needed, only we needed some time to get it operating, right? And that was very confusing, and the media went against it. What are they doing? They're not doing anything. So it was really hard, and I think at some point, Boric and the Apruebo Dignidad had to separate itself for a little bit from the constitution. We didn't see, for instance, the members of the Constitutional Assembly actively participating in the campaign. They did participate more in their territories, more with people, but it wasn't the main flag of the campaign, because they both needed to sort of find a firm ground before and then kind of come together again, which is what I think will happen now. This campaign, I think, what's been very good for the future of the Constitutional Assembly is that, well, on one hand, you have the president that will keep safe this opportunity for Chile to restructure its social agreement, which will probably be better, it has to be better than the previous one. But at the same time, it has given the Constitutional Assembly some time to finish dealing with a certain steps, certain procedures that are not so easy to understand for the people, and that I think have damaged the trust that people have in the Constitutional Assembly. People were expecting that we were going to, start writing down Article 1st, Article 2nd, and that takes time. You need to discuss the procedures through which you will write this. You need to come up with commissions. You need to give space for the people to bring in their ideas, and all these things I think were really hard for the country to understand as a whole. But this campaign has allowed the Constitutional Convention to actually do that, and it's been incredibly efficient. And we have a deadline that's very short. We should have a new constitution or the plebiscite next year, and as far as I can tell, I'm not a member, but I participate actively with, I help members, and I'm in many conversations. We are ready to start writing the Constitution, and the members of the Constitutional Assembly are now sharing a language. They have sort of, there's like a space that will allow for this process, I think, to have a very good, I don't know the word, to have a good process. But it's interesting because the composition of the assembly is very different from the composition of the Congress. I mean, this country has been like a roller coaster in terms of its political preferences, or maybe you look for something different when you elect a member of the Constitutional Assembly than when you elect a member of Congress. I don't know, I'm not a political scientist, but it's a constitution that definitely has much more left-wing presence in many different varieties of what left-wing may mean. Very small percentage of right-wing. They don't even have power of veto. And it was so little percentage of right-wing that the left-wing, which was traditionally against supermajorities, we always fighted for just majority rule. We were happy to give the 2/3 supermajority because we didn't need the majority rule, and this would give us sort of more legitimacy just to have it. So I think it will be very interesting to observe the relationship between the Assembly and the Congress, but I think that Boric will align very, very well with the Assembly, and this will help him a lot, because we know that tomorrow the right-wing parties are going to start the campaign against Boric. And I think that he has proven to be extremely wise in being able to survive these challenges, and the Constitutional Assembly is going to be his main ally, I think, more than the Congress. And if the Assembly manages to recover its legitimacy, which I think it will, it's going to be good news for Chile. I'm happy to talk more about whatever you think, but I think I overdid my time probably.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very, very much, Rocío, and really, really great to have your input on the the consequences for the convention. Obviously, the vote to have a new convention, a new constitution in Chile took place just over a year ago, and I don't think we can kind of overemphasize like what the alternative to a Boric victory was a caste victory. It wasn't like a centrist or centre-right, traditional conservative. It was a far-right, pro-Pinochet model, which, considering everything Chile's been through in the last 2 and a bit years, and obviously longer than that as well, would have been absolutely awful. And I think that following the first round looks like the more likely outcome. So just to say again, it's an absolutely extraordinary turnaround that's taken place in Chile. And I think, massively, we really need to kind of recognize the huge mobilization of people who don't normally vote, of young people, people living in the rural parts of the country. And that this was really, really a huge display of popular participation, which, has reflected in the high turnout and the fact that Boric does have the highest number of votes of any president or president-elect in Chilean history. So, yeah, thanks for that, Rocío. Right, next speaker is Matt Kirkegaard of the Progressive International, Alborada's partner. Really delighted to introduce Matt, who visited Chile as part of an electoral observation delegation organised by the Progressive International. This was last month. And Matt, I'd like you to ask you just to reflect, what were your reflections on that visit? And we've got quite a few questions coming in as well. Please, everyone, do keep your questions, do keep posting your questions in the chat. But a lot of questions about the international context of Boric's election. The left in Latin America is making a really strong comeback. From 2015 to 2018, it was looking quite dark for the left. We had setback after setback after setback, which basically culminated with the Bolsonaro election, which, that leads us on to Brazil next year. Colombia and Brazil in 2022 as well. Progressive candidates polling very well. And yeah, also what is and I will also ask our other speakers to come back in on that point, because I think that's a really important one. But yeah, if you could just talk on your reflections and perhaps look at the international context of Boric's election, which follows hot on the heels of Pedro Castillo's election in Peru and Xiomara Castro's election in Honduras. 3 right-wing, hyper-neoliberalized economies, very much in the US orbit of influence, have come out of that orbit in very quick succession. So yeah, over to you, please, Matt.
Thanks, Nick. No, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here, and honor also to learn from Rocío and Victor. Thanks so much, and thank you also to Alborada for really doing some of the best reporting, I think, in English on Latin America. Please, everyone, support them to the best of what you can do. I think really to start off, it's a resounding historic victory in so many ways, and to put a little bit more statistics on it, it's the second largest margin of victory since the 1990s. One of the only ones over 10 points. We were quite worried that this would be a very tight, contested election at the Progressive International, but indeed it was a blowout. And unless you consider former President Bachelet on the left, it's also the largest victory for the left wing ever in Chile as far as numbers go. Even Allende himself was only elected, I believe, with under 40% of the vote. And not only this, Boric sort of enters the world stage as one of the youngest leaders really in the world. I think he's 35, and there may only be one other head of state younger than him now. So it's really a generational transition that we're seeing, that has, I think, impacts far beyond Chile in that sense. But zooming out a bit, I think especially from the side of the Progressive International and the work that we've been able to do, observing elections. I would even start all the way back in Bolivia in October of 2020. This was really people on the streets against the coup government, on the barricades, just demanding the right to vote at all, to have an election, and then to win and to defend plurinational socialism that's returned there. Then you had Peru at the beginning of this year, where real left, liberal, popular unity against the return of the Fujimori dictatorship, and in the form of Keiko Fujimori, who launched an active attempt to coup Pedro Castillo and is still undermining the government. In Honduras, as you mentioned, I was there just last month. Xiomara Castro, the first woman president of Honduras, has defeated the coup imposed, US-backed, really narco regime of the National Party there. And now here in Chile, so many of these threads are coming together. Legacies of coup governments, of neoliberal dictatorship has been rolled back, first from the power of the streets, from the power of popular movements, in smart political coalitions needed to gain state power. So I think as we look down this list of Bolivia and Peru, Honduras, Chile, all of these were in their moments bastions of really important, I think, right-wing influence in the region, and key pieces in the US's imperial motivations and goals across Latin America in a variety of ways. But now each one of them has moved to the left wing, and yeah, I think just getting into some of the commonalities that we've seen here. I think the first and most important one is the assertion of reassertion of sovereignty, and in that I mean the refoundation of the state. For in Bolivia and Honduras, this means either defending the plurinational constitution, or in Honduras the promise of a new constitution. The same thing that we're fighting for in Chile and in other parts of the world. It's really the emphasis that the people are those that govern, and who are sovereign, not the dictators of old who've written the constitutions, not the capitalists, not the Yankee interests, not foreign investors, or in Honduras the case of narcos themselves. So this is really important that this Boric victory has in my mind saved the prospects for this new constitution, and that's really one of the most critical parts of this victory, and what we're seeing again and again, sort of in this second wave, or I think we need a better term for it, pink tide 2.0, or the red tide, or whatever we're going to call it, but this resurgence of the left across Latin America. And what goes along with the fight for sovereignty is this fight for left-wing plurinationalism. In Chile and Peru, both of the successful movements of Pedro Castillo, and now of the popular forces in Chile, are trying to reorganize themselves as plurinational states, drawing from the experiences of Ecuador and Bolivia. In Chile, you see I believe it's called the Bueno Folle, flying at every Chilean protest, the flag of the Mapuche. The Huipala can be seen across the continent. I live in Colombia, I live in Bogota, and the Huipala is seen on the streets every day, and it's Afro-descendant and indigenous people that are really sort of at the forefront of struggles all across the continent, including in Honduras, for example, with the Afro-indigenous Garifuna people. And there's no better example of this in Chile than Elisa Loncon, a Mapuche scholar leading the constitutional convention, and as Rocío said, I think will be a critical ally of Boric moving forward. Another aspect of this is really, I think, the resurgence of feminism at the forefront of the struggle. Boric ran as a feminist, talked about feminism, and in his victory speech, I would expect, and I think we should hope for abortion to be legalized in Chile, with the new constitution, just as it was in Argentina recently. Chile's constitution will be the first one that's drafted with gender parity. Xiomara Castro in Honduras ran on decriminalizing abortion, one of the most reactionary societies on this issue, and really some of the most important aspects of the struggle in Honduras are being led by indigenous women like Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated, but her daughters continue that struggle in Congress and in the streets. And then, finally, just to wrap up the common commonalities here, I think, that we're seeing. It's the resurgence of also the class struggle itself outright. Castillo said he ran on the slogan, no more poor people in a rich country. It was the Bolivian unions and popular movements and peasant movements that led the blockades and forced that election and won that election. In Honduras, there's not only the promise to refound the constitution, but also for agrarian reform. Victor touched on so many of the social democratic reforms that Boric plans to introduce, and this is which include everything from free healthcare, education, but also I think more promising aspects like a public nationalized lithium company, which could have the possibility to work with national lithium companies in Bolivia, for example. So I think there's really a lot of promise here. And if Boric, I think, had run only on sort of the fear of the return of Pinochetismo, or the fear of Piñera, or what could be lost, I think the victory would not have been as sweeping. The fact is that after the first round, they were able to reconsolidate control, I think, enough on the narrative to make people believe in a positive program again, that something could actually be won, could be gained, that a new vision, that a new Chile was forming to, for a better life, for Buen Vivir, that wasn't just ringing the alarm bells about fascism, or sort of just only being scared of the alternative. So I'll sort of close out there, but I think there's lots more to talk about on the horizon where we're going. Colombia, as we have already mentioned, in Brazil, both of these countries have experienced, I think, some of the most real and present dangers that movements are facing. In Brazil, outright lawfare, like stopping Lula from contesting the elections last time. In Colombia, just brutal violence that's wrecked the country for decades now. So I don't think it's at all a fait accompli what could happen there. It's going to take a lot of struggle and a lot of solidarity internationally to make sure that popular movements have the space to contest elections freely and fairly. And that's a lot of what we've been trying to do at PI, and happy to speak to that more after any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really, really useful summary and fantastic work that the Progressive International is doing. And obviously Alborada is really delighted to be part of the Progressive International. As Matt said, they've sent delegations. Excuse me, I'm a bit hoarse. I'm recovering from a certain virus. It was my turn last week. So yeah, apologies. But yeah, no, really brilliant work that the PI has been doing. And yeah, as I said, do follow them. They're really, really standing up to support progressive and pro-democracy movements and grassroots movements across Latin America and elsewhere. Okay, so we do have several questions. Our scheduled end time was 8:30. I think if everyone agrees, this conversation warrants a slight extension. So we'll go an extra 10 minutes or so. So do keep your questions coming. I want to just ask Victor to also touch upon the kind of international context. Victor, what do you think a Boric foreign policy looks like?
That is a very good question and a terrible question at the same time. I think at the moment, it's quite surprising that it hasn't really been a focus. As you can, with the constitutional process in Chile and the crisis and so on, I don't think that the foreign policy issue has really been at the core of the debate. At least I didn't see that. I think in terms of what he's probably going to do, I suspect, he's emphasized that his government at home and abroad is going to emphasize climate change issues, environmental issues, and human rights. And I think that his trajectory, his past, shows that he will stick to these issues. Now, what will that mean for his relationship with other countries in the region? I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect that he's going to be on de-emphasizing this issue for the first period of his government, because he's got so many things to deal with internally, and also the uncertainty of the assembly and what the new constitution will look like. And I think what I would expect to see, is that once the new constitution has been promulgated and a referendum has been held, and the new institutionality is embedded, that he would then start on a foreign policy. But I suspect he will try and reduce the level of that, at least for the moment. That's my view. I hope that helps answer that question.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Victor. So several more questions. I'd like to address our next question to Rocío. And this is a question from Rosanna Leal. Can you explain why Boric does not have majority support in Congress, and how does this work?
Yes, thank you. It's because we are a presidential system, so we elect the president in a separate election from our Congress. So we had the election before, in the first round, we elected some senators, because some are elected we elect senators every 8 years, but half of the Senate, and all the representatives. So we have we have representatives and senators, and we elect the president separately. And so this has the problem that you can have a president without majority in Congress, which is what happened in Chile for the last, it's been kind of tight, but in the government of Piñera and Bachelet, we had presidents who didn't have a lot of power to do things. And that's why we had a lot of judicial activism, because when the executive power can't do anything, then you have judges starting doing things. But that's kind of basically the answer. Then you have a president in Chile that has very strong power. This is a feature of almost all Latin American countries. We are not parliamentarian systems, but presidential systems. And the president has a strong power in the sense that only the president can dictate certain laws, can start, not dictate, but only the president can start a procedure to dictate certain laws. So if there's no agreement between the president and the Congress, no one can do anything, nor the Congress, nor the president. It's like, so what happens today is that the Frente Amplio, which is the coalition to which Boric belongs, together with the Communist Party, they formed the Apruebo Dignidad. They have not enough. They will have to govern with representatives from the more sort of traditional parties and from new political forces. And our political party system is also very unregulated. So we have a lot of political parties and not a lot of incentives for the creation of coalitions, stable coalitions so much. So he's gonna have to find this majority there. And the last thing I will add is that we have a new political party that's called Partido de la Gente, which was a very interesting political, unexpected, I would say, phenomena that appeared in the election in the first round, and was led by a very obscure character who is never came to the country because he has some debts, because he owes alimony to his kids. And so he has an judicial order that if he comes, he can't leave the country. And the very dark character, but he managed to get 12% of the vote and 7 representatives, which is now the sort of the vote. We don't know if it's gonna go to the left or to the right. I think because of the results we had yesterday, we had reason to believe that it's gonna be more towards the left, or at least, you know, in most of the things we really care about. But he's not going to have super majorities in order to do constitutional amendments, and this means that the Constitutional Assembly has to finish in time, because right now the Constitutional Assembly is completely independent from Congress, has its own rule, its own budget, and it's going to be approved by the people, not by Congress. But if it needs an extension, it's going to need a supermajority in Congress, which we won't have. So I gave a very long answer to a very simple question, but that's that.
Thank you so much, Rocío. And yeah, again, very, very detailed and interesting answer. I'm going to take Mustafa's question next. Mustafa Touris. How do you think the social movements in Chile will keep a tab on the president-elect? Matt, I guess when you were there with the delegation, you met with representatives of different social movements. How did you perceive their position towards Boric? And did they speak of any particular challenges that they felt lay in that direction of a Boric presidency?
Yeah, absolutely. We did. We met with many different social movements, and one of the ones that comes to mind is sort of the most inspiring is called Ucamau, which fights for popular housing. And
can I interject? They are in my film. So if you haven't watched Santiago Rising, the link is in the chat. Sorry, Matt. Please go ahead.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, they're just wonderful, and you know, they're really it's really committed popular organizing from the base. And I don't think they're under any sort of illusions as to the challenges and the necessity of continued force from below to the left that will have to continue for a progressive government to really make the gains that it promised. This is, you know, I don't think that anyone is too starry-eyed about this. I do believe that the terrain of struggle, at least in this beginning, these first years and first year especially, will be the Constitutional Assembly itself, will be the convention, and writing in, assuring new social economic rights that are not you can't just roll back with a change of government. This is going to be crucial, and the success and the defense of the Constitution I think are really paramount in the minds of many social movements. But there's also interesting organizational forms, and one I would mention is the Alcaldía Constituyente of Santiago. I don't exactly know how to translate that, the constituent mayorship, but it's basically an assembly of 50 plus organizations that are in constant dialogue with the mayor of Santiago proper, Asle from the Communist Party, and advise on policy, present new ideas, are working sort of in a dual, not quite actual dual power, but in a dual power situation with the council and the mayor themselves. So this is really an assertion of power from the base, from popular movements directly, and a political official deriving their support from those movements. So as Victor said, Boric in his inaugural speech said this is going to be a government with one foot in the streets. We'll see how real that is, but I hope it's as real as possible.
Great, thanks, Matt. Victor, please, you want to add something? Oh, cool.
All right, thanks, Nick. I was just going to add to that in the sense that I don't think we should forget that Boric sees himself as coming from the social movements, and in many ways he did, and he formed a political party on the back of the social movement that he grew out of. And he has said that his government will be a government of open doors, and that with us, the people come into La Moneda. So I think we will see a new style of government, at least at the beginning. But how that develops will, I think, depend on how constructive those engagements are. Because I think engagement with institutional politics for social movements requires also a sense of where the particular interests of those social movements might need to be sacrificed, delayed, for the interests of the process as a whole. And I think some movements are very ready to do that and are very aware of that, but others are not necessarily. And so there is a challenge there. But I do see amongst many of my friends and relatives in Chile that they are also aware that they need to keep tabs on this government, and that they are willing to encourage through mobilization, to keep pressure on the government to create an incentive for it to stay strong in the face of opposition.
Great, thanks a lot, Vic. So I'd like to go to Isabel's question, and I'm going to address this to Rocío. Now, Isabel asks, I know that migration was a pressing issue within the election, especially with the protests recently. How does Boric address this? So just from a personal perspective, I lived in Santiago for 4 years, 2010 until 2014. And then I was away for 5 years, and I went back in late 2019. And it was noticeable that Santiago had become much more culturally diverse, and there had been quite a high level of migration. And I think, sections of the right have sought to exploit that, particularly, within pressing economic circumstances faced by many Chileans and so on. And I think that was one of CAST's kind of main campaign issues. Perhaps you could elaborate on that, Rocío, and give us your view on the relevance of migration within the campaign, and also, of course, what is Boric's position on that?
Yeah, sure. Boric's position, I think he had to, I wouldn't say change, but he had to emphasize different aspects of his migration policy in the second round, because in the beginning, the discourse was very much, we need to humanize this migration policy, because during Piñera's government, because of the pandemic and series of other reasons, we had a migration crisis in the north of the country. And the response of the government, well, not only we had a new law that allowed the government to do certain things that before it couldn't do, even though our previous law was not a real law, was decreed by Pinochet. But Piñera and his government, they started doing what's called express deportations. And so they would grab the people right in the border that were coming in, and they would tell the people, we suggest that you denounce yourself, and then we can see if we can give you refugee or something. And they grabbed most of these people, put them in white overalls, from the head to the toe, and were sending them back in the weekends, so that the human rights organizations couldn't do habeas corpus, because in Chile we have a constitutional action that's very quick to prevent these kinds of things, because immigrants have a right of due process that were not being given in this exportation. So it was such a dramatic, inhuman policy. It looked bad. That in the beginning we were all, and Boric and everyone was all, we are gonna welcome people, because this is people that needs, a place, they need to be welcome, and we are gonna address it, because right now the government's not only not welcoming the people, but also treating them badly, etc. And then CAST came with a very anti-immigrant discourse, saying he's gonna build I don't know how to call zanja in English, like a big hole across the border. Yeah, so similar to Trump's ideas. He even calculated the costs. This was very concrete policy. And he went to talk to the people in the north. And we saw in Chile the growing xenophobic actions, because the people in these tiny villages in the north were receiving a lot of immigrants. The government wasn't doing anything, so they were living in the streets. It was a real mess. So I think that was expected to be a challenge to Boric. I don't think it was such a big challenge. I don't think I resist to believe that Kast got support because of his immigrant policies. I think it was more the disorder in the south and the situation with the Mapuche people and the disorder in Santiago that gave him more power. But still, Boric sort of presented its policy more as now as a well-ordered migration policy where we will promote legal entrance and we will provide a refuge for people who needs it, and we will have special places to put these people in. We will not send people back, we will see what they need, but we will close the borders and just sort of make sure people enter through the right path. And I think it's called, the policy is called something like organized but human migration, something like that. It's basically just complying with all the international treaties that Chile have and not behaving like so badly as we were behaving before.
Great, thanks, Rocío. Another really, really useful and good answer. We've got about, we're going to go for about another 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to take it back slightly to the kind of international, regional sphere. I think that's reasonable, since this is a kind of international event. And we've got a question from SK, which said, what is the difference with this pink, sort of, you know, the unwanted term, with this pink, what's the difference with this pink or progressive tide compared to the previous tide with Chavez, Cristina, Fernandez Kirchner in Argentina, Lula da Silva, Evo, etc. How is this new tide different in makeup? Is there enough common ground other than common enemies that mean they might come together on continent-wide issues? So, you know, what are the prospects for a strong regional, a renewed regionalist project, as took place in the 2000s under Chavez, Correa, Evo, Lula, Cristina? What are the prospects for building something new, and how insulated will that be from, you know, as always is the case, so interventionist policies from elsewhere, particularly from the global north, yeah, and how, you know, what are the prospects and where will Chile fit within that, you know? And I know it's quite difficult to tell, and this is very speculative, but I still think there's a lot of interest in this, you know, like a very strong regionalist program is far more difficult for, you know, external forces to meddle with than when the countries are fragmented and countries are kind of operating on their own rather than within that strength that they had, you know. And we've seen that in, well, even in 2019 with the case of Juan Guaido in Venezuela attempting to overturn the elected government there. And then with the coup in Bolivia, you know, where the left, the regional left, was not as strong then as it is today. But I think the failure of the interventionist projects in both of those countries has helped strengthen and consolidate the regional left, you know, and has also kind of bloodied the nose of foreign intervention and imperialism. So I'd like to hand that over to Matt first, and then we'll go to Rocío and then to Victor.
Great. Now I'm unmuted. You know, it's I think the critical question for, you know, how durable these gains will be on a continental scale. But I do think that the prospects they're different. I mean, it's a different playing field than Latin America was on, you know, in the first decade of the century, to be certain. But the prospects, I think, are still very real. I mean, I believe that, you know, if he were to come to power, and of course Brazil will be critical, as it's by far the largest country in Latin America and in South America, you know, have really learned this lesson in a serious way. UNASUR was a important, you know, initial attempt to consolidate this, as was ALBA, which is, you know, still very much alive. And you know, I think we will probably see the march toward some constitution of a similar organization, either through the rejuvenation of ALBA or something akin to UNASUR, possibly including, you know, Mexico, where, you know, AMLO has very robust majorities there. It looks like, you know, CELAC could be one one forum for this, at least in the sphere of observation. The OAS has been completely delegitimized and is growing ever more so delegitimized, every day. I think we're really seeing sort of the end of the hegemony that the United States used to pose in Latin America. Now, where that goes, I think is really up for discussion. I think we might see smaller, either topical or sort of regional forums opening up. As I said, maybe CELAC becomes a stronger electoral observer. Maybe there are different economic alliances that are formed around, as I said, possibly nationalized lithium production, which will become only more important in this renewable transition, especially because between Peru, Chile, and Bolivia, something like the majority of the world's lithium reserves are in those territories alone. So I think it's up for a lot of definition, but the hopes are real, and I think the urgency is real, and is a priority for governments across the region. So,
thanks, Matt. Thank you, Rocío. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, only something small, because I feel like I don't have enough tools to speculate about this, but I think it was Victor who said before something that it's gonna be more to the inside than to the outside in the beginning, in a way. I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in order to sort of create this new government, because it's very different to any other political force we had before. The Boric campaign, and I'll just tell you this, so like as an example, they organized in this autoconvocados system. It has to do with the social movement thing, but I remember when we started the second campaign, we were asking, okay, tell us what to do. Where should I go? Where are the t-shirts? And they're like, no, everyone's doing it. And we all had to, I don't know, I'm a law professor. I had to go buy, jockeys. I had to find a person that make hats, and everyone was sort of forced to take responsibility over the election. And I was worried about that, but it worked very well. And I think, so I think the government won't be like this big head of state that's gonna have these big conversations with other heads of state in the beginning, but it's gonna be more alliances, I think, maybe among, I don't know, original people, native peoples, on environmental issues. I mean, more about sort of topics than about institutions. That would be like my intuition, that it will be more like, okay, the water, the Amazons, the COVID, the vaccines, like how to like make changes, coordinate to solve certain specific topics, enabling people to participate in a way.
Thank you, Rocío. And Victor, and this is going to be our final question because we've gone over schedule. So I'd just like Victor to summarize, to speak, and then we'll bring things to a close.
Thanks, Nick. I found that really interesting, Rocío. I think, to go back to the original question, I think the idea of the pink tide, it was a label that was used that hid many differences that existed even in that first set of progressive governments. I mean, if you think about it, you had a kind of neo-developmentalism going on in Brazil and Argentina, and you had 21st century socialism in other places. What really united them was a commitment to develop connections, economic, social, political connections within the continent for Latin Americans, to the exclusion of the United States, which had its OAS and its own inter-American system that it developed along with its hegemony back in the day. So I think what we'll see today is whatever label is affixed to this, pink tide 2 or progressive tide or red tide or whatever, the label will hide substantive differences because those differences remain. They are the result of the histories of the different struggles in different countries and of the contradictions, you might say, that they encounter as part of those struggles. I think I would agree with Matt that we can expect a particularly, and I think in Lula's election, if it happens, will be key to the rearticulation of forces in Latin America. And I think that Boric's foreign policy will be very dependent upon what happens with Lula. And if that happens, then we will, as Matt was saying, see a rejuvenation of UNASUR, CELAC, and all of these different mechanisms that were created, but that have died off with the problems that have been experienced in recent years. But I also think we'll see some changes to the past. I think the indigenous aspect of the new Latin American left, which has come strengthened in Bolivia after 2019, it's in the Castillo government, it's in Honduras. It's becoming an issue, and it will be reflected in the new Chilean constitution. So I think we might see sub-national relations developing amongst indigenous peoples in a way that we haven't seen in Latin America before. And that will be a challenge for governments, but it will also hugely strengthen the social movements in the countries that have substantial indigenous populations. And finally, I think the relationship with China will be key because of the pandemic. You know, Chinese vaccines have been key across the region, even in Chile's relative vaccine success. And so I think we'll see as this tide grows, those relationships with China and all of the benefits that can come from that will be a key part of how this develops. But we shouldn't forget that in places like Chile, Venezuela is seen, particularly by the media, in a similar way to in Spain. It's very toxic. It's a toxic issue. There's nothing, I don't think there's much that Boric can win by association with places like Venezuela or even Bolivia and Nicaragua. So that's why the issue of Brazil is key, because this new left in Chile, I think, is quite Eurocentric in many ways. It doesn't look to the region. It's not like the Allendista left of the past, which was very Latin Americanist. That has been weakened in many ways. And you've seen this, I think, in the debates over what should go into the new constitution. You know, they're looking at Iceland, they're looking at Norway, they're looking at social democracy in Europe. You know, this whole idea of works councils like in Germany, fair rents like in Vienna and Barcelona. This is what Chile compares itself to. And I think that that may change, but it will take time.
Yeah, really, really great answer to finish on. And I guess that brings us to an end. And, you know, it's the start of the next phase in this kind of extraordinary journey that Chile's been on for the last 2 and a bit years. And, you know, let's see what's around the corner. It's a fascinating time. And yeah, do follow Alborada, because we'll be hosting many, many more events like this with many, many more fantastic speakers. Hopefully our guys today will all be back as well to continue the conversation. So with that, I'd like to thank Victor, Rocío and Matt. And please do follow them on social media, follow the organizations that they work with, follow Alborada on social media. Remember, you can watch my documentary, Santiago Rising. And also thanks to Pablo, my co-editor, colleague at Alborada, who's been doing the tech today. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I believe I've touched on everything. So with that, we'll play a couple of songs to leave out, you know, to play us out. Do feel free to continue posting things in the chat. And finally, you've got your mics muted. We leave the microphones muted, having had a couple of bad experiences in the past with people unmuting themselves. So it's like a sorry. But anyway, feel free to clap to the camera. And yeah, you know, onwards and upwards for Chile. And we really, really look forward to seeing everyone at the next event. And thank you so much to all our fantastic speakers. See you next time, everyone. Bye-bye. Oh, yeah.
Espantante Bolívar.